If Napoleon Bonaparte had not arrogantly marched his massive Grand Army into the brutal Russian winter of 1812, could he have permanently unified the entire European continent? For those who only read history on the surface, the answer seems to be yes. But if you critically evaluate the geopolitical chessboard with ruthless realism, the definitive, unyielding answer is, no. Even if Napoleon had successfully signed a permanent, ironclad peace treaty with the Russian Tsar, his unprecedented, colossal empire would have inevitably collapsed into ash sooner or later. Why? Because directly across the foggy English Channel, there lurked a formidable hidden enemy who would absolutely never, under any circumstances, allow that to happen: the British Empire. To profoundly understand the inevitable tragedy of Napoleon, we must first deeply acknowledge his terrifying, absolute power on the mainland. At the dizzying peak of his reign, the French emperor was not merely a brilliant military leader, he was effectively a reincarnated god of war. His highly disciplined Grande Armée had decisively crushed the mighty Austrian Empire at the legendary Battle of Austerlitz, completely shattered the heavily militarized Prussian war machine at Jena, and brutally forced the powerful Russian Tsar to bow down and sign the Treaty of Tilsit on a floating raft in the middle of the Niemen River. From the sun-baked streets of Madrid to the freezing landscapes of Warsaw, the entirety of the European continent had humbly bowed in submission beneath the heavy boots of the French. Ancient monarchs were ruthlessly deposed, and historical borders were casually redrawn according to the singular whim of one extremely ambitious man. On land, Napoleon was truly invincible, an unstoppable armored tank relentlessly crushing everything in its path. However, this magnificent supremacy on the mainland dangerously obscured a fatal, catastrophic blind spot in Napoleon's grand strategic vision. He fundamentally believed that supreme geopolitical power was determined entirely by the sheer number of charging cavalry and heavy artillery firepower on flat, muddy battlefields. He dangerously ignored a silent but incredibly suffocating force: the ocean. And the pragmatic men who mercilessly ruled that ocean absolutely did not care how many glorious land battles Napoleon won, simply because they were actively playing a complex geopolitical chess game at a completely different, vastly superior level, where endless financial capital and heavily armed warships possessed far more destructive power than millions of marching soldiers. Within the highly analytical field of international relations, there exists a fundamental core concept that perfectly explains every single action taken by Great Britain over the past 500 years: the offshore balancer. Imagine the British Isles as a massive, heavily fortified castle brilliantly protected by a completely impassable, naturally occurring moat: the ocean. As a geographically isolated island nation relatively poor in vast land resources but possessing unlimited, aggressive ambitions for global trade, Britain's absolute ultimate survival policy was strictly condensed into one single, bloody rule of the game: never, under any circumstances, allow the European mainland to be fully unified by a single hegemonic power, regardless of whether that power was Spain, France, Germany, or anyone else. Their grand strategy was incredibly cold, calculated, and deeply ruthless. Whenever a powerful, aggressive hegemon boldly raised its head and directly threatened to swallow the rest of the fractured continent, Great Britain would immediately pour literal mountains of gold coins to heavily finance, heavily arm, and fiercely incite the weaker nations to actively form a violent coalition and stab that hegemon in the back. The pragmatic British rarely spilled significant amounts of their own precious infantry blood on the muddy battlefields. Instead, they cleverly utilized their massive, unmatched financial strength to literally buy the blood of the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians. London's famous, enduring geopolitical motto has always been: Great Britain has no permanent allies, nor do we have permanent enemies, we only have permanent interests. And their absolute greatest, most vital interest was a deeply fractured, heavily divided Europe, constantly tearing at each other's throats, permanently unable to ever shake hands in cooperative unity. So why exactly was London so deeply, terrifyingly obsessed with actively tearing Europe apart? The dark secret lies in one single word: navy. Let's do some simple, ruthless geopolitical math. If a single hegemonic power could successfully conquer and firmly unite the entire European continent, that conqueror would immediately possess unimaginable, massive resources. That singular entity would tightly control the endless, rich coal mines of Germany, the massive steel-producing industries of France, and the vast, deeply forested timber reserves of Russia. Once completely freed from the massive burden of defending its internal land borders, this newly unified superpower would aggressively divert all of its colossal resources to rapidly construct a massive, overwhelming naval fleet, completely capable of crushing the British Royal Navy through sheer numbers. For Great Britain, permanently losing absolute mastery of the sea was literally synonymous with national death. If the British fleet was ever completely destroyed, the treacherous English Channel would instantly cease to be an impenetrable defensive moat. It would immediately become a calm, easily crossed river for millions of heavily armed foreign infantry to march directly into London. Britain's incredibly lucrative global maritime trade would be brutally suffocated, and their sprawling empire would collapse. Therefore, aggressively maintaining bloody, continuous division on the mainland was not a random act of senseless cruelty, but rather an absolute, non-negotiable matter of national life and death. Napoleon deeply understood this harsh reality, and Great Britain profoundly understood it too. The titanic, generation-defining war between the two colossal empires was never truly about conflicting ideologies or religion. It was a cold, mathematical, and deeply ruthless battle for the ultimate control of global resources. To truly and clearly see the cold, calculated ruthlessness of the Offshore Balancer grand strategy, we must critically view it through the broad lens of 500 years of history, rather than merely confining it to the specific era of Napoleon. Great Britain absolutely never cared about the personal identity of its enemies, they only cared about strictly identifying who was currently the strongest. In the 16th century, when King Philip II's mighty Spanish Empire violently became the world's undisputed #1 superpower, Britain covertly and heavily funded the rebellious Dutch insurgents and ultimately sank the allegedly invincible Spanish Armada. Moving into the 17th and 18th centuries, when the highly ambitious Sun King, Louis XIV of France, aggressively rose up to demand total domination over Europe, Britain immediately and ruthlessly pumped massive amounts of money into Austria and Prussia to systematically beat France into submission. And much later, when Adolf Hitler's terrifying Third Reich rapidly swallowed Europe whole in the 20th century, Britain once again stubbornly became the absolute final fortress, heavily funding and allying with literally anyone, even the communist Soviet Union, solely to crush Germany. Napoleon Bonaparte was simply the very next high-value target on London's 5-century-long, ruthless kill list. To the incredibly wealthy British elite calmly drinking tea inside their foggy, secure castles, Napoleon was neither a magnificent, glorious emperor nor a terrifying, evil monster. He was simply a highly complex geopolitical equation that mathematically had to be violently solved. They absolutely did not wage war using volatile human emotions. They fought using complex bank drafts, massive cargo ships heavily loaded with deadly muskets, and a highly sophisticated, deeply embedded intelligence network designed to fiercely incite endless hatred across the old continent. The absolute strongest power on the mainland would always, and forever, remain the mortal, irreconcilable enemy of the offshore island. The fateful year of 1805 was the absolute, undeniable turning point that decisively dictated the future destiny of the entire world, marking the ultimate, apocalyptic confrontation between the invincible lion of the land and the terrifying leviathan of the sea. On the bloody mainland, Napoleon displayed what seemed like dark military magic at the Battle of Austerlitz, utterly and completely destroying the combined Russian and Austrian coalition forces, violently confirming his terrifying status as the undisputed king of the continent. Trembling enemies quickly surrendered, and terrified nations rapidly submitted. But just a few weeks prior to that glorious land victory, a far more devastating and ultimately defining event had violently occurred on the churning, foam-flecked waters off the coast of Spain, the Battle of Trafalgar. The legendary British admiral, Lord Nelson of the Royal Navy, unleashed a fatal, highly calculated, and devastating strike, completely tearing apart and mercilessly sinking almost the entirety of the combined Franco-Spanish fleet. The heroic Nelson was tragically killed in the fierce combat, but his bloody death successfully purchased absolute, uncontested global ocean supremacy for Great Britain for the next 100 years. The strategic consequence of Trafalgar was a slow, agonizing, but absolutely guaranteed death sentence for Napoleon. Although he could casually and easily order millions of highly trained soldiers to aggressively trample any major city on the mainland into dust, he could never, ever cross a narrow, salty body of water to physically set foot on British soil. The incredibly massive, seemingly invincible French Empire suddenly became a deeply frustrated giant, securely imprisoned within a vast, invisible continental jail. As long as the churning seas aggressively growled under the massive cannons of British warships flying the Union Jack, Great Britain would remain permanently, utterly safe. And from that highly secure, impregnable island fortress, London slowly and comfortably began to aggressively reach its wealthy hands into the continent, slowly but surely tightening a deadly financial noose tightly around the neck of the French emperor. Completely unable to physically defeat Great Britain with heavy cannons on the stormy seas, Napoleon desperately decided to utilize a completely novel and equally ruthless weapon, massive economic embargo. He aggressively established the sweeping continental system, strictly ordering the complete closure of all European seaports and ruthlessly banning absolutely all commercial trade with the British. The grand objective was to literally starve the British economy to death, forcing the powerful mercantile nation into humiliating bankruptcy and submission. But Napoleon wildly and fatally misjudged the terrifying retaliatory power of the absolute master of the sea. In brutal response, the British Royal Navy simply counterblockaded the entirety of the European continent. They aggressively intercepted and captured any merchant ship that boldly attempted to bring highly desired colonial goods, such as sugar, coffee, and raw cotton, into Europe. The devastating result was a complete, disastrous reversal. Great Britain, boasting a vast, highly lucrative global colonial network, simply continued trading heavily with Asia and the Americas, growing increasingly wealthier. Meanwhile, the European continent was being slowly, painfully suffocated. Sprawling factories in France and Germany completely ground to a halt due to a severe lack of raw cotton. Essential goods became incredibly scarce, crippling inflation explosively skyrocketed, once bustling harbors became desolate ghost towns, and tens of thousands of wealthy merchants went painfully bankrupt. Most importantly, this widespread, deep economic misery bred a massive, smoldering, and profound resentment among the citizens of allied and vassal states towards Napoleon. They bitterly realized they were being forced to endure severe economic oppression solely to serve the boundless personal ambition of a single French emperor. The dangerous seeds of violent betrayal actively began to sprout fiercely across the entire continent, heavily watered by the very economic suffocation that Napoleon himself had unwittingly created. The disastrous, very visible failure of the continental system dangerously forced Napoleon to violently use brute military force to compel rebellious nations to strictly comply. And his absolute first fatal, catastrophic mistake did not occur in the freezing white snow of Russia, but rather in the bloody, chaotic quagmire of Spain. In 1808, Napoleon aggressively ordered his troops to violently invade Spain, specifically to tighten the leaky economic embargo. The brilliant British instantly recognized this as a golden, unparalleled geopolitical opportunity. London immediately dispatched its absolute best military commander, the Duke of Wellington, heavily backed by literal mountains of gold coins, thousands of deadly muskets, and endless ammunition, to rapidly land on the Iberian Peninsula. Britain did not merely send a highly trained regular army to fight, they executed something infinitely more ruthless. They heavily, aggressively financed the very first massive, civilian guerrilla warfare movement in modern history. Tens of thousands of heavily enraged Spanish peasants, heavily armed and handsomely paid by the British, successfully transformed their rugged country into a literal living hell for the occupying French soldiers. During the day, the highly disciplined French army seemingly controlled the major roads, but at night, the deadly guerrillas appeared like ghosts, silently slitting the throats of lonely guards, viciously burning vital food depots, and ruthlessly ambushing slow-moving supply convoys. For 6 brutal, agonizing years, the terrifying Spanish quagmire relentlessly sucked the lifeblood out of 300,000 of the absolute most elite, highly trained French soldiers. Great Britain masterfully utilized its massive wealth and favorable geography to violently force Napoleon to fight a slow, bloody, grinding war of intense attrition that he could never, ever definitively win. Napoleon himself, during his final, bitter days in lonely exile, regretfully and painfully referred to Spain as the fatal Spanish ulcer that had slowly killed his magnificent empire, long before he ever set foot in frozen Russia. If Spain was the sharp, bloody dagger brutally thrust deeply into Napoleon's exposed ribs, the Bank of England was the massive, unstoppable industrial machine that continuously forged thousands of those deadly daggers. The absolute greatest, darkest secret behind the spectacular, catastrophic collapse of the French Empire is a highly pragmatic, unromantic truth: war is unimaginably, astronomically expensive, and Great Britain simply possessed a near-infinite, endless supply of raw cash. Thanks to a highly advanced, heavily modernized financial system, incredibly solid national credit, and massive, continuous revenue flowing from its vast global trade empire, London easily acted as the grand financier for absolutely every single one of Napoleon's many enemies. Throughout the incredibly destructive, long-lasting Napoleonic Wars, a staggering 7 massive international coalitions were heavily formed to violently fight against France. And exactly who paid the massive, crippling financial bill for all of those massive coalitions? It was, unequivocally, Great Britain. London consistently and ruthlessly pumped massive, life-saving financial subsidies directly to Austria, Prussia, Sweden, and Russia specifically so they could continuously, aggressively rebuild their shattered armies. Napoleon may have been an undisputed, unparalleled tactical military genius. He could brilliantly defeat the Third Coalition, spectacularly shatter the Fourth Coalition, and brutally crush the Fifth Coalition. But that meant absolutely nothing to the deeply pragmatic British. If a massive Russian or Austrian army was violently annihilated today, Britain would simply send massive, overflowing chests of shining gold tomorrow to heavily recruit and fully arm a completely new army. Britain's terrifying superpower was its massive ability to comfortably absorb devastating military defeats using endless capital, while Napoleon was forced to painfully pay for his glorious victories using the irreplaceable, spilling blood of young French men. It was a wildly, fundamentally asymmetric war between strictly finite human manpower and completely infinite financial capital. By ruthlessly using gold to purchase the blood of other powerful nations, the ruthless Offshore Balancer successfully transformed Europe into a massive, non-stop meat grinder, continuing relentlessly until the French war machine was utterly and completely exhausted. Now, let us critically return to the massive, hypothetical question posed at the very beginning of the video: what if Napoleon had simply not marched his massive army into Russia in 1812? The harsh historical truth is that Russia itself had actively and aggressively torn up the continental system because their fragile, agriculture-based economy absolutely could not survive without highly lucrative trade with Britain. Napoleon was fundamentally, strategically forced to brutally attack Russia merely to maintain that fragile, failing embargo. But let's assume for a moment that he completely ignored Russia's defiance and successfully signed a permanent, ironclad peace treaty with the Tsar. Would that peace have actually lasted? Absolutely not. Because as long as the mighty British Royal Navy maintained absolute mastery of the sea, and as long as the Bank of England remained heavily overflowing with gold, London would never, ever leave Napoleon in peace. They would simply send covert, highly persuasive envoys carrying massive, heavy chests of cash directly to Vienna, to Berlin, and to St. Petersburg. They would ruthlessly bribe greedy state ministers, violently incite the local nobility, and aggressively fan the raging flames of anti-French nationalism in every single occupied nation. Sooner or later, Austria, Prussia, or Russia itself would be completely unable to resist the massive, overwhelming temptation of British gold, and they would inevitably take up arms and violently stab Napoleon in the back yet again. For an aggressive empire built entirely by the sword like Napoleon's, the exhausting, endless necessity of constantly crushing massive, British-funded rebellions everywhere, from bloody Spain to freezing Eastern Europe, would inevitably and painfully bleed the French army dry, causing it to collapse heavily from the inside out. Great Britain had masterfully and calculatingly created a highly toxic geopolitical ecosystem where permanent, lasting peace on the European continent was simply a tantalizing, completely unattainable illusion. The catastrophic, spectacular collapse of Napoleon Bonaparte was absolutely not a random accident of history caused by terribly harsh weather or a single, foolish tactical blunder. It was an absolute, mathematical inevitability that strictly obeyed the ruthless, unyielding physical laws of geopolitics. You can undoubtedly be a once-in-a-millennium, unparalleled military genius on the dirt and mud of the mainland, but absolute monopoly on the continent will remain permanently, entirely meaningless if the vast, surrounding oceans are tightly held in the hands of your enemies. Great Britain's deeply calculating offshore balancer grand strategy was decisively proven to be a cold, perfect, and utterly unbeatable geopolitical weapon. After finally and brutally crushing Napoleon at the muddy Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the massive British Empire simply continued to aggressively apply this bloody, mathematical formula for the next 2 centuries. When Kaiser Wilhelm II's mighty Imperial Germany aggressively rose up to dominate Europe in World War I, Britain immediately intervened to violently shatter it. When Hitler's terrifying Nazi Germany violently attempted to unite Europe in World War II, Britain once again stubbornly stood firm and ruthlessly smashed it to pieces. And today, this unbreakable, fundamental law of geopolitics has absolutely not disappeared. It has simply been smoothly transferred from the tired hands of the British Empire directly to their powerful descendant across the Atlantic, the United States of America. The modern US is effectively the greatest, most powerful offshore balancer in all of human history, masterfully utilizing the vast oceans and the overwhelming power of the dollar to aggressively ensure that the massive Eurasian landmass will permanently and forever remain divided, never to be dominated by a single, terrifying hegemon. The tragic, monumental history of Napoleon is a highly expensive and deeply brutal lesson. Geography is, ultimately, destiny. The vast, eternal ocean will always, inevitably, defeat the land.